No mai haere mai, kia ora koutou. It's me, Lis, of course, and you're listening to Weekly Liscourse. Coming to you from the cold, icy swamp of Otepoti Dunedin in Aotearoa on the 2nd of September 2017. I'm going to talk a lot of bourgeois nonsense today, including NAFTA, BRICS, and the concept of utility. I think this episode might end up being a little bit shorter, but mein Gott, it's hard to talk about some stuff without just wanting to stop. Understanding bourgeois nonsense, however, means we get to take one for the team, and we all know how us leftists love flogging ourselves, so this should be somewhat of a treat for some of us. Thanks for listening. Remember to follow me on Twitter on @WeeklyLiscourse and send me some messages, tweets with anything you want to hear me talk about, or any points of discussions on the things I have talked about, hate mail, etc. I love to hear from people. And without further ado, here is some stuff that has gone on this week. Dominating the news has been the floods caused by the hurricane/tropical storm Harvey, which is now thankfully over, but over the affected areas in Texas and Louisiana, the death toll has risen to 45 and expected to go higher after the recovery phase. 1,800 people were killed in the Hurricane Katrina events in 2005.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Repairing Houston and the affected areas will not be cheap though, and neither will be the future events which will be exacerbated by climate change, such as Hurricane Irma in the Atlantic Ocean as we speak, heading towards North America. Oh yeah, speaking of which, crazy flooding is continuing in South Asia, namely India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, with the death toll already higher than 1,400. These floods have been going on for 2 months, schools have been destroyed, crops in some of the poorest areas have been completely washed away. Some are blaming the government's poor responsive measures to floods which hit annually due to monsoon seasons, while they say chill out and don't blame us, this is the worst flood in decades. Now, climate change hasn't created Hurricane Harvey nor monsoons, but the warming of global temperatures exacerbates the damage of such events, and in the future will make much of the world plainly unlivable. Thanks, capitalism! A 10,000-person march of supporters of refugees happened in Rome. The march was organized in response to police attacking a group of camping refugees who had been evicted from the building they were occupying for 5 years. In a quote from Libcom, the migration deal signed by the Italian President Gentiloni and Libyan sovereign Fayez al-Sarraj, the code of conduct imposed by the government on NGOs, the Miniti Orlando decree on immigration. They all respond to the neoliberal paradigm that is reigning supreme in Europe. Supporters in Italy are calling these attacks police brutality in the face of resistance to xenophobia and neoliberalization of housing. In Cuba, as Raul Castro's rule is coming to an end, people flooded the streets of Havana in support of Venezuela against the sanctions imposed on them. Workers, students, and other solidarity groups opposed the executive order signed by US President Donald Trump, which imposes tough sanctions against the country in political and economic turmoil. Venezuela, not Cuba, obviously. Moving on to Brazil, post-coup president Michel Temer, who has a popularity rating of 5%, has just sacrificed a reserved area of the Amazon equal in size to Denmark to mining interests. The reserve, which is in Para and Amapá states, contains large preserved areas and indigenous communities. However, on the 29th, federal judge Ronaldo Spanholo annulled both of the contributing decrees, citing Brazil's 1988 constitution, and ruling that the Raqqa preserve may not be abolished by presidential order but only legislative action. The Brazilian Union's general advocate said it will appeal the judge's decision. Hey, let's hope this 4.6 million hectares of land does not get eaten up by the bourgeoisie, please. Even though unauthorized mining is already going on there, which is how they know that it's full of gold and nickel, iron, manganese, among other minerals. The main benefactors from the opening up of the area would be Canadian mining interests. In June, the Brazilian-Canadian Chamber of Commerce announced a new mining commission focused on mining in Brazil, and is attempting to portray the opening up of the reserves as good for the environment. Around 30 Canadian mining companies exist in Brazil currently. The battle for Raqqa rages on, as on Thursday, 13 members of the Syrian Democratic Forces were killed. Among the perished was Adnan Abu Amjad, commander of the Manbij Military Council. The commander fought to liberate many areas including Manbij and Kobani. The SDF General Command said the barrel of his gun will not fade until the defeat of terrorism. In an online statement, the SDF said that they had killed 40 IS militants in the eastern front of Raqqa and 30 others in the western front. At the western front, they said they have been fighting fiercely in the neighborhoods of Barid, Murur, Nahda, and Daria in the west part of the city. The rescued civilians included 8 children, 6 women, and 4 men who have been transported to the safe liberated areas. Daesh's territorial area is nearly all gone as they will be forced to retreat to a few strongholds in the Euphrates Valley. This battle has been bloody and terrifying. The civilians in Raqqa are living in hell, and it's awful to think of 2 months of the continuation of a bloodbath with the idea that it might intensify as suicide bombers come out. As the YPG commander Newroz Ahmed said, there are about 700 to 1,000 ISIS fighters left in Raqqa, and that the battle should be over in about 2 months, but expects the battle against the group to intensify. She also warned IS would continue fighting until the end, with many of its remaining militants in Raqqa foreign fighters who will carry out suicide attacks. ISIS has been known to use tunnels in Iraq and Syria, not only for sneak attacks, which the militants reportedly pay terrified civilians the equivalent of $2 per day to dig, are also used for moving supplies, housing ISIS fighters, and laying booby traps. Former ISIS fighters have said that some of the tunnels are extremely complex. Some of them even contain rooms, toilets, and medical facilities. A civilian who has been living in Raqqa for 3 years has said that a short beard or pants can lead to a $150 fine, 3 months in prison, or a trip to the Sharia camp. He says a friend told him that he stayed at home for a month because he had burned off part of his beard while attempting to light a cigarette, which is punishable by flogging, the smoking. This civilian's account also said, the city is devoid of doctors and the market is devoid of food. What food there was in our fridges has rotted because of the absence of electricity. Everyone knew the city would be besieged, but civilians could not stockpile food because prices are high. A month ago, I had a loaf of bread and a bowl of za'atar, a cucumber, and some halva. I couldn't go out to buy more because no shops are selling food in my neighborhood, and walking a long way was too dangerous because of the airstrikes. In the last few months, the SDF have attempted to take control of Raqqa. They got there in June, and now the situation for the civilians stuck there has become worse. Airstrikes and shelling continue throughout the day and kill many people. ISIS snipers also target those who attempt to flee. The SDF have, however, liberated over 60% of Raqqa, which is the militant group Daesh, also known as ISIS's de facto capital and last major stronghold in Syria. The SDF advanced into Raqqa in June after months of battling militants in surrounding areas. Daesh's territory may be all but gone, but their ideology isn't something you can blow up. We can expect more attacks from Daesh all over the Middle East and all over the world, as they are a sickness, as is any fascism or reactionaryism. Remember that class consciousness and solidarity are the virus to that illness. And remember that people who conflate Muslims with Daesh would probably get along just fine with members of Daesh, God forbid them intentionally collaborating. Moving on to some topics about global trade and finance, the President Donald has been waving his hands, screaming about NAFTA.
And I must be honest, and I've been talking about NAFTA for a long time, and I'm sorry it's taken 6 months, but we have to give notice. You have to see this. We have to give notice. And after the notice is given, you have to wait a long time. Then you have to give another, then you have to wait a long time. Anyway.
NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed into effect in 1993. The deal effectively removes barriers to trade, such as tariffs and quotas, between Canada, the US, and Mexico. This has led to the US and Mexico switching balances of payments, with the US now importing more from Mexico than it exports to Mexico. This is because manufacturing, car manufacturing, and textiles started to be produced more in Mexico and less in the US, as the implementation of low wages attracted those specific industries. The Trump administration has used NAFTA's hollowing out of the good old factory days as a political selling point to his economically nationalist fan base, promising to protect American workers. Yep, that's a dog whistle right there. Here, boy, come in, come on. Yeah, that's a good boy. Good boy. Trump does not give a shit about American workers. He wants them all to be stuck working in factories and coal mines with low wages and no right to unionize. Although Trump's administration's plans for the deal may help the US restart some manufacturing, the main American benefactors will be the elite manufacturing sector in the US. Funnily enough, Mexican workers would actually be better off as artificially low wages will have to be done away with. This might, however, plunge Mexico into an employment crisis as the major players in the private sectors reshuffle their interests. The second round of talks over the deal are underway in Mexico City as the three countries state that they are committed to an ambitious outcome. As I covered in an earlier episode, Robert Lighthizer, the representative for the US, said that fundamentally NAFTA has failed many Americans, with the other two governments saying that the deal was not biased against the US. These new rounds of talks will address the modernization of the deal, accounting for the existence of the internet, e-commerce, and the general shift in late capitalist work environments and rules. The Trump administration in these talks are looking to get rid of the arbitration which is used against the US by Mexico and Canada when the US violates the agreement. They also want to instate a rules of origin tax where items manufactured in one country get an import tax for their inputs. Canada wants to protect these parts of the agreement, as well as adding in sections about neoliberal labor and gender rights. For example, the free movement of certain professionals across borders and the ability for them to work without a visa in any of the three countries. While Trump has threatened to withdraw completely from the agreement, it is likely that he is just pandering to his fan base. If he actually starts the withdrawal process, Mexico's centrist president Enrique Peña Nieto has said that he will withdraw from the negotiating table. This is unlikely to happen this time around, but these negotiations will continue with another round later on this year in Canada. Mexico is also due to have a presidential election next year, with the new center-left nationalist Morena party on the rise, and their leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador currently in first place according to a survey. Obrador claims that if he was in charge of the negotiations, he would go ahead with the modernization and institute an economic overhaul which will involve the creation of public-private partnerships while reviving agriculture with subsidies. In more financial nonsense, the 9th BRICS summit starts tomorrow in Xiamen, China. So I thought I'd spend a bit of time talking about BRICS. BRICS is an association of emerging economies and is an acronym which stands for its members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. There are two main financial branches to BRICS: the New Development Bank, NDB, and the Contingent Reserve Agreement, the CRA. The NDB's objectives are to 1. Promote infrastructure and sustainable development projects with a significant development impact in member countries. 2. Establish an extensive network of global partnerships with other multilateral developmental institutions and national development banks. 3. Build a balanced project portfolio giving a proper respect to their geographic location, financing requirements, and other factors. As such, the bank gives the members loans of up to $34 billion annually, while also allowing for new members, although BRICS' capital share is to make up over 55%. At the moment, each member nation has a 20% share and 20% voting rights in the New Development Bank, as each member put in $10 billion to start the organization. The NDB was signed into treaty in 2014 and in 2016 supported 7 projects, mostly in renewable energy. Except in Russia, no solar, no wind, please, just hydropower. The NDB stresses it is not a financial competitor bank and is meant to complement rather than compete with the other multilateral groups like the IMF and World Bank Group. The other financial component of BRICS, the Contingent Reserve Agreement, CRA, is another loaning organization. The objective of the CRA is to provide a cushion of protection against global liquidity pressures, including when member currencies are affected by global, aka American and EU pressures. The contribution makeup in the CRA is different to the NDB, with China providing a whole 41% and South Africa providing only 5%. There is a chance this agreement could challenge the hegemony of the US dollar in the global finance system, as less US dollars are kept in treasuries with an agenda to stack up their own national currencies as reserves. While people have been lauding the developments regarding BRICS as a viable alternative to a US-dominated neoliberal global capital order, giving the global south more economic independence, BRICS. The actual institutions of BRICS are not that dissimilar to their counterparts like the World Bank and IMF. The association started as an attempt by China and Russia in the then G8 to reach out to other emerging economies of the world. The current BRICS members make up 40% of the world's population and approximately 22% of gross world product, as well as having a combined GDP, which adjusted for PPP, makes $37 trillion US, with China and Russia having permanent seats on the UN Security Council and 41% of the CRA contributed by China. It's safe to say that these agreements will indefinitely favor Chinese finance and Russian oligarchy. The other members are so-called democracies setting up their own trilateral forum to safeguard their interests, with South Africa and Brazil in democratic turmoil and India's nationalist leader overseeing incursions into Chinese territory, prompting a foreign relations spat. It will be interesting to see the developments of the summit starting tomorrow. Let me know what you think about BRICS. Is it any better than the IMF or the World Bank? Should the Global South band together and fight neoliberal fire with neoliberal fire? Is BRICS not ideal, but at least protects workers in the Global South against crises manufactured in the North? I'm going to go back to this next week covering the summit, so send me your ideas and questions. When you hear the words evidence-based policy, what do you think?
Common sense. It just bloody works. No ideology.
No ideology. No ideology. Objectively good policies. No ideology. What the hell are these policies, and what is this evidence based on? There are very good and nice smart people who want to make a difference in welfare. They train for years and learn many things so they can help us. They help us increase our happiness, well-being, pleasure, utility. They learn to understand us and why we make the choices we do, what motivates us and how our rationality helps us decide to eat one cupcake instead of another. Utility. That is the word we are focused on today, utility. I think it's not too great of a term. It's vague, nebulous, and an abstraction, but is supposed to represent things which are very real and have impact, supposedly. Utility can be an individual's welfare, or an aggregate, which means group, of everybody's welfare. Say there is a chocolate cupcake and a chocolate cupcake with sprinkles. Say you're hungry and you want to eat one, but you don't like sprinkles. Given the choice, and you being a rational decision maker, you would take the one without sprinkles because it gives you more utility. Say a society with a preference for pizza consumes more pizza in 2017 than in 2016. The welfare is higher in the more pizza year, therefore so is the quantified number of utils or aggregate utility. Social scientists use the concept of utility not just as individual and aggregate measures of well-being, but also in an attempt to understand the rationality which underpins decision-making, thus making the concept applicable both in a descriptive and a normative manner. In my first mission statement, I explained that normativity refers to the idea that something should be one way or another. Arguments which claim to be descriptive assert that the goal of understanding is how things actually work. This is a distinction that future economists are taught straight away. The descriptive application of utility is used in many ways today in expected utility theory, decision-making theory, rational choice theory, and other fields which attempt to explain human decision-making as driven by the will to maximize utility. The normative application of utility is in ethics, in the idea that at any point in time there is an ideal condition for society to be at, where aggregate utility is maximized to its potential. In the words of John Bentham,
the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people.
Note then that utilitarianism as a philosophy values the utility of the greatest amount of people rather than just individual utility. John Bentham is credited for the creation of the extremely influential liberal moral philosophy known as utilitarianism. As the name suggests, this philosophy aims to explain morality as a product of individuals seeking self-satisfaction or happiness. As such, the adherents of utilitarianism believe that an action's consequential outcome of utility is what defines its moral value. Morality can then be quantified according to pleasure in the eyes of the John Bentham. John Stuart Mill, who I talked about last week, is also known for his contributions to the philosophy of utilitarianism. While Bentham was a hedonist, Mill was much more anally retentive, and so the idea of utility as pure pleasure struck a chord with him. "It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied," he famously said, meaning that there are forms of goodness and well-being which should be maximized but are not necessarily linked directly to increasing physical pleasure. Things like knowledge and artistic culture were things that Mill wanted to bring into utilitarianism, while Bentham before him thought that there was fundamentally no difference between going to an opera and playing hopscotch. Mill and Bentham were by no means the first to ask these sorts of questions, though. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle identified a condition to be striven for in society, which he called eudaimonia, translating roughly to lively demons. This condition represented a balance which is maintained by citizens who cultivate their own virtuous living. This version of the good society is much like Mill's open and tolerant liberal society, except instead of cultivating virtuous living, citizens and institutions act rationally according to the moral maxim of utility. In between Mill and Bentham, much confusion can arise about how utility is defined by utilitarians. Bentham's ideas culminated in the expression that a single quantifiable value of happiness, using a felicific calculus, could be called utility, while Mill's approach is more pluralistic and qualitative, and he rejected the so-called felicific calculus. When we talk about utility, we could be talking about either of them unless we specify or modify the terms. For example, a single numerical value of utility might be dissected apart into different contributing factors, while a multitude of factors of well-being could be consolidated into one numerical value, and boy have people been keen on doing this over and over again, going along with Mill's quest to diminish the amount of suffering experienced by the most amount of people. That's right. Economists, policy advisors, lobbyists, marketing specialists, all kinds of special interest groups use these sorts of valuations to argue for the implementation of policies in liberal institutions. Even though many fundamental questions about the nature of utility have not been answered properly, it has proliferated in many areas. Earlier on in this segment, I mentioned the descriptive aspect of the concept of utility in such forms as expected utility theory. These frameworks have been incorporated into economic models and are widely taught in universities and used in public policy making and advisory. Expected utility, formulated by itself, is a method for calculating an individual's rational decision making. There are axioms which describe people's decision making, like consider a restaurant where you can order two options, bread and corn. You prefer bread to corn and you prefer corn to oats. A rational expected utility maximizer orders the bread, and then the chef comes out and says, but we have oats too. The rational person would say, I don't care, get me the bread because it is my clear preference, recalling that the preference is bread, then corn, then oats. And an irrational kooky person who violates expected utility changes their mind to ordering corn after being advised that oats are also available. An expected utility maximization framework allows economists to make calculations which take into account things like preferences for consumption in time periods and also in uncertain conditions. As behavioral economics grows, some cling hard to the expected utility framework and keep adding variables to account for all of the different relevant details that are discovered. Others have abandoned it and look more to the psychology or neurology behind economic decision making. The assumption that humans consume at the margin according to rationality is something that came later than Mill, as well as the idea of diminishing marginal utility. Diminishing marginal utility refers to the phenomenon that the first corn you eat is great, then the next corn you eat is still great but a bit less so, until you get to the point where you keep eating corn but derive a lower amount of satisfaction from each bit of corn eating. The decrease in utility gained from each bit of corn eating is known as diminishing marginal utility of corn. Margins are therefore important when we're talking about the application of utility, as is rationality, because these things are assumptions that many frameworks of neoclassical economics relies upon. Like, all of them basically. Utility for them is also both the motivator for individuals acting in a certain way and the justifier for certain actions. The introduction of margins and rationality to our discussion of utility and all of this stuff puts us squarely in the realm of contemporary liberal frameworks used in economic and social policy research and advisory, a field where utility is most definitely used as a measurement of happiness or well-being. In the sense that utility acts as a motivator for individuals, consider this model that economists use. A model made up of two choices, labor and leisure, sometimes called the labor-leisure model. The subject can't do both things at the same time, and the more labor they do, the less leisure time they have. But the more labor they do, they can also consume more using their wages.
Good little wage slave.
They will choose some possible combination of labor and leisure, acting according to their preferences between consumption and leisure. The point they choose will be the one that maximizes their respective utility. In this model, a reservation wage or endowment point is considered. This is a point where even though the subject is not working at all, not even 1 hour, they can still consume a certain amount. The logic goes that if this point is high enough, the individual will not choose to work and instead only consume at that one point since it satisfies them enough. The reservation wage is how the model incorporates welfare payments, and the labor-leisure model says that if welfare exists, people will basically not do any work, or be put off working because they're already receiving money. It started off as a simple model, and now we're saying we gotta smash the welfare state to get people to work because they won't otherwise. If you're wondering where neoliberal policymakers get their rationale from, it's here. Other sorts of welfare measurements exist in such frameworks too, and the idea of surplus value is not only a Marxist one. Welfare economists use neoclassical tools to measure certain areas which lay beneath demand lines and above supply lines. They term the losses deadweight losses, and they talk about both producer surplus and consumer surplus, since the lines are derived from supply and demand lines. The welfare in their case is easy to measure since they only measure in terms of quantity and prices, i.e. money. They have an easy out when asked how do you know welfare is equally linked with money. They would say, well, it seems to positively correlate, but we're not claiming total causation. Then they accept their measurement of welfare as a limited one, and one whose limits are easy to account for. The limits of utility, however, are more complicated, as it is a multifaceted type of measurement, which could include hedonistic pleasure, the ability to play chess, basic needs being satisfied, as well as pain, famine, death of loved ones, and discrimination. All of these effects can be coagulated into one Benthamite felicical calculus, or explored more intimately and qualitatively like Mill would have. Something I haven't been able to quite get is, are these the same things? Some suggest that Mill was much more inspired by Aristotle's interpretation of balanced and lively developmental happiness than Mill historians typically think. Let me know what you think. Talking about the concept of utility grows tiresome, and I'm tired of it right now, and I'm sure you're probably tired of listening about it. Basically, I think there's tons of problems with it. It's nebulous and abstract, yet it's too simplistic and too positivist. If you don't know what positivist means, listen in again next week, and I will be talking about positivism. I'm also going to come back to utility later on, so give me a buzz, any questions you have on Twitter, with the handle @weeklyliscourse, or leave a comment on whatever platform you're on, and I'll respond to you on the next episode, hopefully, because I do this every week, hence the name Weekly Liscourse, which is also my Twitter handle, @weeklyliscourse. Another thing I would like ideas for is different types of segments. Do you want to hear me in conversation with people? I sound like a dork unscripted, but hey, I could always give it a go. Should I have a response segment or geography challenges or whatever? I want to be able to use this medium to its full potential and not just stick to the same format every single damn time. I also wanted to let you all know that I have a Patreon, so yeah, please go to that and give me money and increase my utility. I love doing this, but it's a shit ton of work and I'm broke as fuck, so please consider donating to my worthless yet vaguely informing enterprise. I hope I have been piquing your interest so far. You should keep listening because there's going to be some plot twists coming up. For now, enjoy the rest of your day. I love you all.